Here? Awesome. All right, well, good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight for our inaugural Headlines in Hops event. We are so happy to see so many of you here and at Alamo Beer, which is going to make this a lot more of a fun conversation. Thank you, Eugene from Alamo Beer, for hosting us today. And also thank you to Market on Houston for providing the food for tonight's event. Yes, you guys have all enjoyed the food. So we're here and we're excited to have a thoughtful and fun conversation about politics. We're going to talk about this
weekend's upcoming mayoral runoff. We're going to talk about the contentious district council races, other hot button city issues like annexation and development. We'll talk about the city's involvement with the SB4 lawsuit. Statewide, the governor's called a special session to address 20 issues, including the bathroom bill and property tax reform that failed in the regular session. That begins on July 18th. So let's get started. First, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves. We'll start with you, Josh, and what I'd like is just to tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what interests you most about your beat.
So my name is Josh Baugh. I'm the City Hall reporter at the Express News. I've covered City Hall since 2009, and I just find it incredibly interesting. There's new stuff happening there all the time, and I don't think I can count the number of council members I've covered in these several years now, but it's definitely probably in the, I would say, probably 50, 60 range. And I think that city government, it impacts everybody in this room and it impacts everybody who lives in San Antonio. And our council members are making decisions for us on a daily basis that have as much impact on our daily lives as the state house or the federal government. So,
hi, I'm Brian Chasnoff. I'm Metro columnist. I cover politics mostly. I'm from San Antonio. I was born here. And I've been writing a column now for about 4 or 5 years. And I think what interests me the most about it is just learning about how people work together or don't work together to govern. It can get contentious sometimes, and I enjoy shining light into areas that might not otherwise get a light shown into it. And I do enjoy the more investigative side of journalism, and I try to cram that into my 3 columns a week if I can. But thanks for coming.
Hi, my name is Vianna Davila. I cover city issues, urban issues, a little bit of growth at the Express News. I've been there basically since 2002, so I've covered crime, I've covered transportation from San Antonio. What I love about my beat and what I love about journalism in general is the opportunity to kind of peel back the layers of things that we see, happening in the city, whether it's city policy or just, when I was covering crime, what was happening behind, shooting or anything like that. Just what's really happening, what's happening with people, what are their real stories, and thank you for coming.
I'm Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist. I was born in Brownsville, grew up in Edinburgh, and I've lived in San Antonio since 2002. And I started out as a music writer and kind of stumbled my way into writing about politics. And if you'll indulge me for a second, since I started out as a music writer, today would have been the 59th birthday for a great American music legend, Prince, so I just wanted to mention that. And I'm wearing purple, but it's just an accident. It's pure coincidence. So I've been a Metro columnist since 2012, and I probably would echo what Brian said. And I think one of the things that's great about being a columnist is that, we're living in a time where it's very contentious politics, and a lot is going on every level, national, state, and local. And as a columnist, you're sort of forced to try to assess what you think is happening, to try to make some sense of it in your own mind. And sometimes it's hard to make sense of it. But that's the challenge that I think we face every day. And that's what I love about it. Thank you.
All right. I just realized I forgot to introduce myself so that you all know who I am up here. I'm Jamie Stockwell, and I'm the managing editor at the Express News. I've been at the paper now for 10 years. I also come from Edinburgh and from the Rio Grande Valley. I went to school at UT Austin and then left the state for 8 years and lived in Washington, D.C., where I worked as a reporter at the Washington Post. In Washington and San Antonio haven't been all that different lately, so it's been a really fun reporting job for us. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the questions that I have for our panelists, and then I'd like to open it up for some questions from you, if you have any. I also collected some questions that a few of you sent in over the last couple of days. I've incorporated those in my questions as well. And if you guys will indulge us, then we'll get started. So thank you all for being here. Also, afterwards, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Express News. If you don't have a subscription, I'm going to give you a code so you can get 30 days free access to our subscriber website, expressnews.com. Thank you. All right, guys. So over the last month, the city's mayoral race has taken a deeply negative turn, with incumbent Ivy Taylor behind a website that mocks Ron Nirenberg called liberalron.com, and Nirenberg behind a flyer that claims San Antonio, which is truly one of the safest cities in the country, is crime-ridden and dangerous under Taylor's leadership. Then there's the mailer backed by a group that nobody knows where it came from, called Strong Texas Values. Doesn't seem to exist, and no one is taking credit for it, that asks, which Ron is running for mayor? It doesn't matter. Both are bad for San Antonio. Clearly, these are two opponents fighting for their political careers. How is this year's tone different from past races, and what does it say about this year's election cycle and the candidates themselves? Whoever wants to answer, if you each want to take turns answering it, go for it.
Okay, I think what we're seeing in this runoff is somewhat similar to what we saw in the runoff 2 years ago between Ivy Taylor and Leticia Van de Putte, in the sense that the negativity, the intensity didn't really start till the runoff. I mean, this year we had 3 major candidates, and I think if you were Ron Nirenberg, your concern was really Manuel Medina, because you were thinking, I want to get into a runoff, and he's the obstacle. And the assumption was Ivy Taylor's going to be in a runoff, and the challenge, the question is who's going to be in the runoff with her. So I think the focus from his campaign was on Manuel Medina, and vice versa. Now it's 2 people, and so I think that's what's happening. 2 years ago, when it became Leticia Van de Putte and Ivy Taylor, Leticia Van de Putte was raising questions about Ivy Taylor's husband and the fact that he didn't press charges when it was a drive-by shooting at his bail bond business, and I think we all remember that Ivy Taylor refused to shake Leticia Van de Putte's hand at a forum. So that one got really ugly. I think the last 2. I would kind of set them apart from other races that we've seen in recent years, because they hadn't really been like this, I think, until 2015. I don't know what you'll think about that.
This race is interesting to me also because it's the first time I can think of in some time where the 2 major candidates in the runoff actually have worked together on council for a while. In the last race, none of the major candidates had, except for Ivy, had been on the council. In the race before that, and 3 races, I guess, before that, it was Julian Castro not really facing any major opponents from council. And then before that, it was Phil Hardberger and Julian Castro, and Phil also had not been on council. So that creates an interesting dynamic this time around.
I think that the negativity that we see in the runoff election is so stark because we didn't see much of it coming from the 2 candidates or in the runoff during the general election. Manuel Medina was really the attack dog throughout the general election. And he attacked Ron, but he attacked Ivy quite frequently, and those 2 candidates spent a lot of the general election just trying to set the record straight, because a lot of Medina's attacks weren't based in fact, and so they found themselves in a position where they had to refute what he was saying and explain what they actually had done as council members and the mayor, taking action on the various issues that were up for debate.
And so now we see a focused campaign with an incumbent attacking a challenger who's worked with that incumbent, and it's
been incredibly stark and powerful to see, and it's I think turned off a lot of voters. I've talked to a lot of people who are upset with both candidates because it has become so negative.
And I also think Ivy and Ron have not gotten along for quite a while now. I think Ivy kind of begrudged Ron for his ambition. The perception at City Hall is that Ron has wanted to run for mayor for a long time now, for years. And Ivy, of course, she was appointed interim mayor, and when she was appointed, she said that she wasn't going to run. So there's been this back and forth, sort of this argument about who's the most ambitious, and who, it's hard to fault politicians for being ambitious. That's why they're there. But they have definitely butted heads, and they do not. There's no love lost between them.
Ron Nirenberg is fond of saying that too. That at least he's made his political ambitions clear over the years, whereas Ivy Taylor had that promise when she was appointed the interim mayor to not run, and then changed direction several months in. So I think that's a really good point. And did you?
Well, she's got a political ad out on TV. I think it was the first TV ad that she had put out, and it talks about her being a planner, not a politician. But I think that if you look at the course of this runoff election, you see that she very much is a politician.
Yeah, absolutely. And so several of you touched on this, and Vianna, you recently wrote about this issue, but over the last 4 years, as Ron Nirenberg and Ivy Taylor have worked together on council and then as mayor and councilman, they have disagreed far more than they've agreed on major issues that have faced the city, including annexation, regulations for ride-sharing companies, non-discrimination ordinance, and you may remember the proposal last year to give Taylor immunity for violating city ethics rules related to her acceptance of Section 8 housing vouchers for properties that she and her husband owned. So how do their differences in not only personality but in governing affect current council business, and what would each administration mean for San Antonio residents at large?
It's interesting. I think you could argue that there has been a lot more divisiveness on council, partly because of their relationship. I mean, it's pretty typical to have, districts 8 through 10 have traditionally been a little bit more conservative. And when Castro was mayor, he definitely had a block that was sort of like 1 through 7. So he always had, a strong sort of hand. There were often a lot of unanimous votes. When he was mayor, it feels like you see that less now, these unanimous votes. She has sort of a block on council, and Ron, though, is often on his own on certain issues. But he, I think, makes the argument, that means I stand up for what's right. What could be interesting, if he wins as mayor, can he get consensus then? Since he's often stood alone, will he be able to do that once he's in the big chair?
And what's interesting, too, is that they have disagreed on some things, but in some cases, it's more complicated because they both voted the same way on the Vista Ridge contract, but then Ron has more recently said that he has misgivings about it as the financial arrangement has changed, and and they both voted, well, or I think Ivy was absent, but they both supported the zoning case involving the Mission Trails, but Ron has changed his position on that. But what we've seen, I think the divisions have intensified with the campaign, because just in the last 2 weeks, they parted ways on the lawsuit over SB4. Even though that was done in executive session, we know that Ron supported the lawsuit and Ivy Taylor didn't. And the river barge contract that you pointed to, I mean, Ron voted on his own on that.
I also think one big distinction between Ron and Ivy, maybe in terms of personality or how they approach governing, is with regard to transparency. Ron, I think, feels obligated to be transparent maybe at all times. I could be being naive there, but I know he talks a good game when it comes to transparency, and he's very accessible, and he would never want to be perceived as hiding anything or not being accessible to the media or the public. Whereas Ivy is not necessarily that way. She does, for example, the group that she put together to improve policing in San Antonio, she closed a couple of those meetings, and that was controversial. I don't see Ron ever running into that kind of conflict with the media.
I would say that, looking back over the past several months, you see politics playing out a lot in council votes. So like the barge issue, for example, the barge issue, SB4, any of the things that we can talk about up here about those decisions that council has made, I think it's hard to not look at it through a political perspective. And I think that Ivy and Ron are both looking at how they make their decisions and how that impacts their would-be constituents. So it's kind of a tough spot for San Antonians, because you could argue that your business is not being done in the best interest of you, because they're constantly thinking about campaigning. There has been some discussion about changing term limits and shifting from 4 2-year terms to 2 4-year terms, which would give you some longer stretches where you weren't having these constant political battles. And then circling back to the issue of what each administration would mean to San Antonio, I think that the easiest way to kind of discern the two is that Ivy Taylor sees herself as a meat and potatoes type mayor, that she's focused on the streets and sidewalks and drainage, and she's talked about it not being sexy governance, but it's important governance. And I don't think that Ron has a particular issue with avoiding that kind of stuff, but he's, I think, seen as more of a visionary, kind of a throwback to Julian Castro, who I think he looks to in sort of a mentorship kind of a way. So if Ron were to be elected, I think that you would see some more movement towards bigger picture, bigger project kind of things in San Antonio.
I would say maybe one footnote to that is that I think the relationship that exists between whoever gets elected mayor and city manager Cheryl Scully will be very interesting, because I think Ron is definitely someone who's been more aligned with Cheryl Scully. Right. He's very close. One of his, I think it'd be fair to say that he looks at former Mayor Phil Hardberger as a mentor, and obviously Phil Hardberger brought Cheryl Scully here. So on the river barge contract, when he was the lone vote in opposition to the contract that was awarded, he was basically in alignment with Phil Hardberger and Cheryl Scully. And I think we've started to see in the last year that the sort of truce that the relationship that existed between Ivy Taylor and Cheryl Scully, which there was has been a manageable working relationship. We started to see the tension come out in public a little bit more. I don't think Cheryl Scully was very happy about the police union contract. That was really, Ivy Taylor really led the way on that, and the city manager went along, but I don't think she was real happy about that. It was pretty clear, and obviously on the river barge contract, they had some real public conflict.
Let's circle back to the river barge contract and SB4. In the case of SB4, several cities have joined in a lawsuit, and Brian, you've written a column that's online probably already right now, and is going to be in tomorrow's newspaper, about the politics behind that. Why don't you tell everybody here a little bit about what you've written?
Well, so Senate Bill 4 is the so-called Sanctuary Cities Bill. It was signed by Governor Greg Abbott last month. And the takeaway here is that it stops cities from prohibiting its officers from asking about residents' immigration status. Up until now, the San Antonio Police Department was very adamant that having police officers ask residents about their immigration status or enforcing immigration law in any way actually would hinder the core responsibilities of the police, which is to respond to calls for service and prevent and solve crimes. And the logic there is that folks who might be afraid of getting deported are much less likely to talk to police if they fear that talking to police would cause them to get deported. And that's why Police Chief William McManus, along with most of the police chiefs in the major cities across Texas, were against this bill. But it did pass, and the local angle is that last week, Councilman Ray Saldana led a charge at City Hall to sue the state for this bill and saying that it's unconstitutional. And Mayor Ivy Taylor, she objected to the city suing the state for this. And there's a lot of things at play here. I think at first blush, you could say she wants to please the Northside conservatives who helped elect her 2 years ago and who could help elect her on Saturday. But at the same time, I think that more fundamentally, this bill is, again, about local control. And there's a slew of issues that are coming up in the special session that Abbott just called. I think he had 20 priorities, a list of 20 priorities. I think 6 of those would directly inhibit the freedoms of cities to exercise autonomy in how they govern the community. And I would argue that Senate Bill 4 is one of them, although that's not in the special session because it's already passed.
Good. I'm glad you brought up that piece because we'll come back to city politics here in just a minute. But, the 2 issues that really dominated the legislative session this year were sanctuary cities and the public bathroom use. So Senate Bill 4 passed, as you said, but a watered-down version of Senate Bill 6, which would legislate bathroom use in the name of public safety, is back on the agenda for the special session. The session could cost taxpayers up to $1 million. What can we expect from lawmakers on this issue and on other big issues? Representative Joe Strauss, who's from San Antonio and Speaker of the House, has said that passage of the bathroom bill could mean the loss of hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue for the state. What's the mood of local elected officials on the special session and the priorities that the governor has placed?
Well, I think that it's interesting that you could sense that Joe Strauss, who's the most powerful lawmaker from San Antonio, is not didn't sound like he was real enthused about the special session. And I think that what you're really seeing is, there's a power play at work between really three key Republicans here. I think the power play between Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and Governor Greg Abbott is more about ego and who's going to be seen as the more powerful. But I think they basically agree on all the red meat and social conservative issues. Joe Strauss kind of stands apart from that. I think he has a view that's more sort of business-centered, and he doesn't really, I think, have much enthusiasm for some of the social issues. So I think Dan Patrick used his leverage. He used this this issue of what was a sunset law that was going to create a situation where you had state agencies shutting down, like the medical board, and he used that to sort of force a special session. I think Greg Abbott was annoyed with him that he did that, and he showed his annoyance yesterday. But I think he's probably also annoyed with Joe Strauss, because Joe Strauss has fought Dan Patrick on the bathroom bill. So what you're seeing is this dynamic between the three of them, and I think it's going to be really interesting and very, very tense. And there's always the possibility that the way this is set up, this sunset law has to be dealt with first. Greg Abbott stipulated that they can't get to any of the other 19 issues until this is addressed, because this is what he considered the most pressing issue. But once they do that, I think there's going to be a lot of conflict on some of these issues, like the bathroom bill. And there's always the possibility Greg Abbott could call another session. So it's really it's going to be a difficult situation.
Vianna, one of the topics up for discussion in the special session is annexation, which you wrote about last week. Senator Campbell's bill died thanks to Senator Menendez. So tell us a little bit about what city officials are fearing with that bill and how it could affect the city's opportunity to grow.
Annexation is a really interesting issue because it's very divisive in the sense that if you're here right now and you live in, basically within 1604, it doesn't affect you at all. This is really about the people that live on the edges of cities in areas that have often developed a great deal, but they're not within city limits, like North Bexar County and far West Bexar County. Right now, the power in Texas to annex really rests with cities. The law changed a bit in 1999 and put some more stipulations. Before, cities could basically grab and do whatever they wanted very easily. Now there's far more limits on what a city can do than there were before. But Senator Campbell's bill would basically almost totally strip that power away. It would say residents who live in unincorporated Bexar County, so again, a lot of areas outside of 1604 on the north and south today, you get to vote on whether or not you want to become part of San Antonio, or you can petition. It kind of depends on the size. For San Antonio, there's a huge fear of that it will stop us from growing. They don't always mention tax revenue. They don't always like to talk about tax revenue, but that's a huge part of annexation, is the ability to grow your tax revenue by adding these new areas that have a lot of new homes, a lot of new apartments, so there's higher property tax values. So cities, not just San Antonio, are very afraid of that. Just one thing about San Antonio, we are one of the few large cities in Texas that isn't landlocked on all sides. Dallas is pretty much landlocked by suburbs all around it. Houston largely is as well. So that's a huge fear here. But cities are also concerned about encroachment on the military bases. Bases, this is an example used a lot. Camp Bullis does night training missions. So if there's a lot of development around them, the fear is that there will be too much light, too much noise, they can't do those missions. And maybe they won't pull up the entire base, but maybe they'll pull up the mission, the night training missions. Well, that creates a domino effect. So then you might have a lot of military, pieces of the military move, and that's a huge could be a huge blow to the economy. But of course, Senator Campbell has said, and Representative Larson, that that's just a false narrative, I think is the words that she has used, that it's not really an issue and there's enough protections in place today.
You know, speaking of growth and development, Vianna spent about a year chronicling the city's development. Last summer, we published an exhaustive, authoritative series on the region's growth and how the city is facing the enormous challenge and preparing for the anticipated 1.1 million people who will be coming to the area over the next 20 years. If you haven't read it, highly recommend it. It's great reading, I promise. You can find it on expressnews.com, I think /the_next_million. I could be wrong, but Google it. So, Vianna, your project examined a number of issues facing the city, from the environmental impact to the ramifications on the school system to the growing divide between the wealthy and the impoverished. In what ways are city leaders focusing attention on these issues?
This is a really interesting question, and I'd be curious to hear from anyone else who may have insight into this, because the city adopted a comprehensive plan last year. Did anybody know that? Who knew that the city adopted a comprehensive plan last year? Okay, it's very few people. So this, the city has really lauded this plan. They said this is how we're going to manage growth and sort of decide how we want to be as a city so we can accommodate all these new people. But that plan has very little teeth to it. In other words, city council, this one and futures, have to enact policies to regulate growth as much as you can in Texas, right? We're a very property right heavy state. So I think actually Ron Nirenberg has made looking at development a big issue of his. He really believes in protecting the Edwards Aquifer and the recharge zone. Ivy is also, she's a planner, and she says that it's a huge issue for her, but I don't know that we have yet to see city council kind of move forward with some of these measures. They're in the process of developing, you know how it works, you develop a plan and then you develop more plans. Well, that's what they're doing right now, developing smaller regional plans that the city says is going to help regulate development. But I still think it's to be seen. We still don't have a climate action plan in place, I believe, which is sort of to limit how much emissions we have here. So we still don't have the city's supposed to form like a noise abatement and light pollution committees to study that, and I don't know that that's happened yet either, so it's to be seen.
It's a lot of planning.
It's a lot of planning.
Yeah.
That's what they do well. Speaking of planning, voters approved last month a massive $850 million infrastructure and development program. It's one of the largest bonds in the city's history. And construction on some of these bond projects is expected to begin in the next few months. Vianna, I'm sorry to keep tossing these at you. I'm going to come back to you guys too here in a minute, so don't think you've gotten away.
Yeah.
So a lot of it pertains to the upkeep and maintenance of streets, drainage, parks, $13 million to connect the two halves of Hardberger Park, for example. $20 million is earmarked for a housing initiative to fund development of affordable and mixed income housing. As you've reported, the city was short 153,000 affordable housing units last year. How is that housing bond going to help remedy the sense that San Antonio is indeed composed of two halves, many families living in inadequate apartments and homes, but also just this great sort of north-south divide?
I think the housing bond, I don't know if anyone from the city is here, I think it's a good step forward, but I think it's just going to make a small dent in the problem we have here. The way $20 million is not that much money. It'll go quickly. The other part of it is the developments they can be mixed income. So that means only 50% are guaranteed for people who live, I think it's 80% of area median income, right, who's family of four. So that means the other 50% could be hypothetically any income level. I think another 30% could go to commercial uses. So we're not necessarily talking about a lot of new units. The city was partly hamstrung because of the way the charter is structured. We can't do a lot of things we'd like to do for affordable housing. It's a start, but I think the problem here, you have issues with school districts here, and that contributes to the north-south divide. So I think it's, again, I'd love to hear from anyone else about what they think about that, but I think it's a long, long road ahead.
I think probably one of the more interesting takeaways from the housing bond is that as we were reporting throughout the general campaign, we were hearing a lot that was going to be kind of a big stumbling block for the city, that there's a lot of opposition to it. And it was I guess, the least favored of the 6 bond
Right.
propositions, but it still did incredibly well in terms of elections in the 21st century. And so I think it says a lot about where San Antonio voters are, and that it's not all about just picking projects that are going to help your neighborhood or your area of town, because that was something that reached to all stretches of San Antonio.
And this was something that, I mean, I think Tommy Calvert, the county commissioner, wasn't he talking like about $100 million initially, having both city and county? So he had something much more ambitious in mind initially,
Yeah.
but I don't think the mayor was.
Yeah, he could never really get the mayor on board with
Yeah.
that idea. Yeah.
All right, we're going to turn our attention back to the district council races. We've got some really interesting ones this year. 6 of the 10 council seats are up for grabs this weekend. So at this time next week, we are going to have maybe the same mayor, maybe a new mayor, and we are going to have a majority new council. So what's the potential makeup, and then how is this new group going to affect the dynamics on the council and also affect change in their new terms?
What's kind of fascinating is that we could go a couple of different ways. I mean, we know we're going to have at least 5 new members of the council. We could have up to 8. Unlikely, but possibly as many as 8. And if you look at it, I mean, we could have a much more conservative council or a much more progressive council. We've got in District 8, we've got Cynthia Bram, who is a pretty strong conservative, running for a seat that Ron Nirenberg, who's pretty progressive, has held for the last 4 years. In District 10, you've got Ezra Johnson, a progressive, running in what has always been a conservative district and possibly winning that. So there are a few districts that we could have a clean sweep by one side or the other. I think another thing that's really interesting, we haven't seen a real big early vote turnout. It's pretty similar to what we saw 2 years ago, but the fact that we only had one runoff in 2015, aside from the mayor's race, we had a District 7 runoff. This time we've got several, and so I think we're going to see turnout bumps on election day in those districts. And the question is, who's going to turn out in districts 8, 9, and 10 in particular? I think we're going to see a really big north side turnout, which someone could say could help Ivy Taylor. I've heard people who've been looking at the numbers saying that when they've been breaking it down, looking at the early vote, that they're seeing like a third of the voters are new voters who didn't vote in the general election, and some of them are people that have been associated with Democratic politics. So we're gonna see what happens there, but I think that the turnout in those races is going to affect the mayor's race in a real interesting way.
I think one interesting thing about these runoffs is the presence, seems like the ubiquitous presence of Carlton Sewells. I don't know if y'all remember him, but he was a councilman. Laughs. In District 10, he was, I would describe him as cantankerous. I think, Gilbert, you called him Dr. No in one of your columns. He was usually against things. But he has rebranded, refashioned himself in this second career as a consultant. And for example, in the District 10 runoff, he is consulting for Clayton Perry, who is the much more conservative candidate in that race. But strangely, Carlton also was working for Manuel Medina, the chairman of the Bexar County Democratic Party, during the mayoral race. And I don't know, is he helping anyone else?
So he is still consulting for Cynthia Brim in 8, and he briefly consulted for Melissa in District 6, who's the progressive candidate in that race. And I think we left out 6 and 9. Both of those have a kind of traditional conservative candidate and a traditional progressive candidate. So leaving out Districts 1 and 2, all 6, 8, 9, and 10 all have that kind of very dichotomous choice of what you're going to do. And so one of the things that we haven't talked too much about yet is the fact that we're seeing a lot more partisanship playing out in both the mayoral races and the council races. In some instances, you'll see direct identification with parties. In other instances, they use catchphrases and political issues to identify where they're headed. A lot of people, I think, are bothered by that because San Antonio is a nonpartisan city when it comes to municipal government. Lots of politicians who campaign in traditional campaigns and talk about potholes and drainage. They say that those things don't have a D or an R. But a lot of things the council's addressing at this point do have some political leanings, and so we're seeing that overlay across San Antonio local politics. And I think we're seeing some carryover also from the November election in the way that the campaigns behave.
Speaking to that point, in District 9, John Courage, who has run for office as a Democrat in the past, he's run against Lamar Smith for Congress, for example. And he's running District 9. I think it's fair to say it's our most conservative district. And he's in the runoff, and he says, when he knocks on doors, people ask, well, what party do you belong to? And he answers it. I think he tries to get in another answer before I think he goes to the issue that Josh talked about, like what party, potholes don't have a party or something like that. But it's but that's what I think a lot of candidates are saying, that they're going out there running for nonpartisan offices, and people are asking, well, what party do you belong to? And we're in a hyper-partisan environment. We see it in our national media, and we see it in everything, in every element of American politics right now.
Yeah, and one question that will be answered on Saturday night is how that carries forward. There's for conservatives, there's some vindication because Donald Trump got elected, and so there's some question as to whether they're going to kind of sit back on their laurels in this election, and they feel like they've done their job, and it may not drive them to the polls, whereas progressives have a lot at stake, and they're very upset with what had happened in November, and that could drive some turnout on Saturday. Whether it will, we're a few days out, but if you see a sweep, if you see Ezra Johnson win in 10, if you see John Courage win in 8, in 9 specifically, those are those traditional conservative districts. I think that shows that there's that angst that progressives are pushing back and saying that they're not satisfied with the current status quo politically.
Well, thank you, because you just checked off like 3 of my questions with your answers. Excuse me. Because as a nonpartisan, municipal elections, it has really taken that turn. So let's then turn a little bit to Washington. And I think we have seen a shift in how local and state candidates are running their campaigns. As you said, knocking on door, potholes don't have parties. They're not affiliated with parties. But how are we seeing, too, just the way that the campaigns are being run beyond those sorts of answers?
I mean, you could argue that we started to see political, partisan politics come into municipal government when Julian Castro was named keynote speaker for the DNC. He was a rising star for the Democrats, and he shifted from being a nonpartisan mayor. While he stayed nonpartisan on the dais, when he was walking off the dais and he was going out into our community and going across the nation, he was doing so in a hyper-partisan way. And so that you could argue that kind of carried forward the idea that we're going to start to bring partisanship back in. And then the connection between November and Donald Trump's campaign and what we saw in our mayoral election, there was a big question going into May 6th as to whether everything had shifted in the way that campaigns were managed and run, if Donald Trump had created the new template, and that's what we're going to see, and that we're going to see people start finding success in behaving that way. And Manuel Medina took the Trump playbook, and he used the same language, he used the same tactics. He held a protest on the steps of the Express News and claimed that Brian was fake news.
Racist too.
And a racist, yeah. And so he really pushed the campaign about, against the media, using fictitious information to try to drive voters. He had some very, very fervent supporters, but ultimately he got about 15% of the vote, and it was an abysmal showing for somebody who spent the time and effort and money that he did.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought that up too, because we did receive some really great reader questions over the last couple of days, and I wanted to touch on this era of fake news. Yesterday, Trump tweeted, not for the first time, that the mainstream media is fake. Brian, you noted recently in a column that it feels as if violence is the first resort in American politics. Everybody will remember, the Republican U.S. representative who slammed a reporter to the ground after he asked a question about health care in Montana. You guys just brought up Manuel Medina on our front steps for that press conference when he didn't like a column he wrote, and yet he didn't call and ask us for a correction. There wasn't a single false fact there.
Yeah, I think that's the key word there is correction, because I've been at the newspaper for 12 years now, and the worst day you can have as a newspaper reporter is when you come in the next morning and you have to write a correction because you got something wrong. And you're absolutely obligated to write a correction if you got something wrong, inaccurate in any way, even if it gave the wrong impression. And so when folks bring up this accusation of fake news, I don't really think you can lob that at journalists who are under that obligation to correct inaccuracies. Every day we come in to get it right, and that's our first and foremost responsibility, is to get it right. Even if you're writing an opinion column, you still have to get the facts right. And so I think fake news, it implies that it's just false. And I just think it's important to keep in mind that we're not allowed to do that.
The term fake news has been stolen, right? And it's been applied by people who disagree with what they read in newspapers, what they see on broadcast. And the origins of what we know as fake news was the accusations that the Russians had, and Americans actually had monetized and tried to hack our elections by creating fake websites that masqueraded as news sites. They looked like they were legitimate. They had articles that sounded like they were legitimate. They read like they were legitimate, but they were completely fake. That is fake news. A column that has an opinion that you disagree with is not fake news. It's just something that you disagree with.
Right. And I think that's right. And Trump has been skillful in the past too at taking something that maybe taking a term and then changing its meaning and applying it to his political enemies. I would say that with regard to the fake news thing, that I think that one of the things that makes the climate that we're in more difficult is we're bombarded with cable news, and they've got to fill 24 hours. And some of it involves bringing on reporters from really great newspapers who are out there digging for stories and providing valuable information. And some of it is just talking heads just speculating on a bunch of stuff. And some of it is people conjecture about what Trump's psychological state is, and a lot of stuff like that. And regardless of what you think of him or any politician, a lot of that stuff I think is kind of garbage. It just doesn't. It isn't fake news in the sense that the term came into being, but it doesn't really. It's just filler, and it's not valuable. And so I think that some of that material plays into the hands of people who want to believe that the press is just spewing out a bunch of fake news. And so I know I get frustrated with it because I think there's a distinction between some of that when you see, Corey Lewandowski or somebody like that on CNN and getting into it with somebody else, and it's just nonsense. I see a big distinction between that and the work that someone like Vianna is doing, where she's going out and reporting about what's going on in our city and things that we need to know about the future of the place that we live. That's a completely different thing. And so I get frustrated with that sometimes.
I just want to say that, I think we all have to ask ourselves. I'm assuming everybody here is a connoisseur of news since you're here, but and a news reader, but ask yourself, what do you trust? Who do you trust? I teach one night class a week at Texas State, and I took my students to the New Braunfels City Council this past semester, and they were covering a proposed smoking ordinance. And a woman spoke in a public forum, and I told the students, go get her name. And she said, "Oh, I don't talk to reporters." Now, these were student reporters. It was about a smoking ordinance. She just talked in a public forum at a public city council meeting. And I told them, well, tell her, that to get it right, you have to talk to her. And none of them were successful. We encounter that all the time. People say, they blanket us in that way. And I think you need to ask yourself, if a reporter asks you a question, would you answer them? Would you trust them? Or do you know people that maybe you do, but others wouldn't? And, just sort of as a civic duty, I would just ask all of you, counsel people that there are news outlets you can trust, and that is the way you get true stories out there. If you don't talk to us, we won't know what's actually happening in your community.
Yes, and that's key. We get asked that a lot. Why didn't you write about such and such? we didn't know about it. And so it's really important that if there is something that you feel we aren't covering that we should be covering, we call any one of us because we want to hear about it. I get asked a lot how the Express News vets news stories and how we vet pitches and such. And I want to say we do work very hard when we receive pitches or news tips. I mean, we have to report these out, and we make sometimes dozens of phone calls to sort an issue and then distill whatever that complex topic is for our readers. And oftentimes, if you go onto our website, you'll see that we post documents with our stories. So we're quoting documents that are publicly available, and then we post them, we upload them. We get audio as well. So we quote people as best as we can, and we really pride ourselves on our mission to tell the stories that really matter to the community, to you, and to do so in a way that is accurate and credible. We want you to believe us because we're here for you. That's one reader question that kind of this segues right into, and then I'm gonna open the floor here. The future of local journalism. People always ask us, are you guys okay? Are you gonna still be around? Yes, we're here to stay. We're not going anywhere, I promise you. But this reader wrote and asked if if more and more people are getting their news from an internet feed, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, that doesn't address local issues, how can we as a local news organization confront that and compete in that kind of market? And I want to say that local journalism looks like this. All of you who are here and participating, local journalism for me is participatory, it's involved in the community, it's being engaged, and then engaging in a real conversation with real people who have real questions and are truly curious about the cities and the communities in which they live. That's our mission every day. I think I want you guys to talk about it too, but I think we pride ourselves on that and coming to work every day and just trying to do a kick-ass job for all of you. What do you guys think? How do we compete? Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, BuzzFeed and the New York Times and whatever else you want to point to, they're not in San Antonio, and they're not covering city council meetings. They're not covering the MPO. They're not going to commissioner's court. We go and cover all the things that matter to you guys because you can't be there yourselves. Council meets at 9 o'clock on Thursday mornings, and a lot of you are probably at your jobs at 9 o'clock on Thursday mornings, unless you've gotten a special call from a council member to come testify on something. And so, I go to those meetings and I write stories that tell you guys what you need to know about what happened. And every once in a while we're accused of having an agenda, and I would say that we do have one agenda. I think everybody on this stage has an agenda, and that is to clearly and concisely explain what is happening in your community to you. And it doesn't go beyond that. There's no conspiracy, there's no grand conspiracy to shift, to push your thoughts into a certain direction. We want to provide you with the information so that you can make up your own mind. And I think that we see that in reaction from our readers when we write a story and we get a nasty email from somebody on one side and a nasty email from somebody from the other side, or a great email from somebody on one side and a great email from someone on the other side. You as a reporter, you start to worry if you get one group sending really great emails and another group sending really terrible emails. Then you got to step back and say, wait a minute, did I cover that accurately? But for the most part, it's a daily attempt to bring you guys the information that you need, and we work in unison to make that happen, and that's the agenda.
Good. All right. One reader question quickly before I open the mics. I don't know if you're here, but somebody sent a question wanting to know about construction at 281 North and 1604. When is it going to begin? So we chased down that answer. Vianna, you have that.
Okay. So, yeah, you know the answer. Was it your question? I don't know. But basically, there's supposed to be work on actually making it a freeway from, 1604 to the Bear-Comal County line. It should start, I believe, in July. I think some preliminary construction work has begun, but you should see more construction start in July, and the first part of that is going to be the connectors for those who live out there. The northern connectors connecting 281 to 1604. It should take about 3.5 years to do that, but in the end, you should have a highway all the way to the county line, which you don't have today, and it's going to have HOV lanes, so that's not a toll road, not toll roads. It's just like carpool lanes. So hope
Aren't you
that
glad
helps.
you asked? Great.
Yeah.
3.5 years. Fun. Remember when the Hildebrand section was closed and that was going to take like 18 months? It went by like that. So
Yeah, it'll go real fast.
yeah. That one
Yeah,
took
yeah.
years and
That
years.
one
That
took
was
years.
that felt like forever too. But hey, now you can get onto 410 really easily. All right, questions.
Can you tell us about the bomb threat downtown?
The bomb threat downtown. Yes. So I don't think we were all in the newsroom when it was detonated. A suspicious package was detonated. Yes. So we have the Metro editor here. She can answer that question. We'll get you a mic. One sec. Everybody, this is Nora Lopez. She's also from Edinburgh.
We do.
We got our little South Texas contingency up here. Well, you can use Gilbert's mic.
Yeah, just use it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't have too terribly much to share, but I can tell you that there was nothing in the package. The SAPD did explode it, and they examined it, and there was no kind of incendiary device or anything like that in it. We learned that 3 men had been detained. We found out later that these were just 3 men who happened to have been at the post office, because there is a post office down there. My understanding is that these men were dark-skinned with beards. When I left, it was not made clear to me whether these 3 men actually had the package or if the package was just sort of noticed near them or what have you. But as far as we can tell, there was no bomb downtown. It was just some folks who got a little overeager. I could be disproved in the next hour, and these men may have something more, but the preliminary information we got was that they were just happened to be there and got rounded up when somebody noticed a package and they thought it was suspicious.
All right, stay tuned. Real news. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank all of y'all for being here tonight. This is a wonderful opportunity for the public to listen to y'all talk.
Thank you.
And I hope we have this a lot more. It's
Me too.
been very informative.
Yes. Eugene, you heard that, right?
Yeah, free beer.
Yeah.
You've touched on this a little bit, but what just distresses me about coming out of Washington these days is the attitude that we need to put restraints on the free press. And there's been talk, I think, about a constitutional amendment. There's been talk about changing the libel laws and that type of thing. And I'd just like to hear your comment on that.
You know, I mean, if we look at it in the historical context, I mean, it's not new that the media is under attack. I mean, you go back to the Watergate era and some of the things that the Nixon administration was saying about the Washington Post, and they were really harassing the Washington Post. And I think someone found the headline the other day because they were looking at the parallels between what's going on now and the Russia investigation, and it was like Nixon administration says this Watergate thing is a big witch hunt, you know, because we're hearing the same term used now. So the media is always going to be a convenient target. But I do think that what we saw in the Trump campaign, where one of the things that really alarmed me was the way Katie Tour of MSNBC was treated. Like Donald Trump would actually like single her out because her job was to cover the campaign, and he would like point her out in a crowd of 20,000 people and start like picking on her and basically get the crowd stirred up against her, and then she would get like, you know, verbal abuse from people leaving. It's an intensity that we haven't seen before. And as you said, there's been talk about changing laws, and so I think it's really scary. I do believe that sanity will prevail on this, and I would like to think that even the president's political allies in Congress will draw the line when it comes to this sort of thing. But it's always been easy to pick on the media, but now it's getting more intense. In some cases, it's getting physical, and I know. I mean, I've gotten some emails from people, and I had a recent exchange with someone who apparently thinks my name. He can't decide if my name is idiot or dumbass. But he just uses them interchangeably. But he gets really, you know, vicious, and I considered it a small victory just over the last week because, I try to sort of respond as though he's being nice to me. And I just pretend he's being nice to me, and I engage him and try to explain my take on things. And the last email I got from him like 2 days ago was like, well, I'm going to keep emailing you, but I'm going to try not to call you idiot anymore. And so we're not friends yet, but you got to take these small victories where you can, so.
I think one of the more insidious ways that there's been a devaluing of the press is you can look at the White House press pool, and there's been news organizations, actual fake news organizations that have been allowed now into the press pool at the White House. And so there's sort of this simultaneous thing going on where the Trump administration is allowing these sort of rogue elements in journalism to have more of a voice, and at the same time calling actual legitimate news organizations fake news. So I think it's sort of, as opposed to just an outright attack on the press, that's another way that they devalue actual journalism.
I think that we're also in the midst of an era where good journalism is more important than ever because we're in the era of social media. And so what that does is gives politicians the platform to speak directly to the public. And historically, the press has been the gatekeepers, and so the press would get information and then fact check and ensure that the statements that are being made are accurate, and then call out people for saying inaccurate things. And with social media, these politicians can take their opinions and their statements straight to the voters, and that's a very powerful voice. I mean, NPR today was talking about how Donald Trump's Twitter account is the most important Twitter account in the world, and you need good journalism to continue doing that fact checking. We need to protect journalism. We need to protect journalists to ensure that we don't just give carte blanche ability to the people who represent us to say whatever they want without having any kind of checks on it. It's incumbent upon us to verify the veracity of what they're saying, and I think a great example locally was that Manuel Medina in his campaign talked about being the transportation mayor and wanting to reduce drive times in the top 50 most congested corridors by 10% in the first 5 or 6 months of his mayorship. And when he said that, it struck me as being odd. I didn't think it sounded like it was particularly plausible, and so I did some fact checking, and I talked to people in the city who would implement the changes that he was saying that would need to occur. And the reaction was, no, we can't do that. It's completely impossible. The things that he's talking about doing would take multiple bond cycles. Those are 5-year cycles, and so it would take in the order of a decade or two decades to do the things that he's talking about doing in 6 months. And so we write a story that says that he's making this claim, but it is inaccurate. A side note to that, he continued to say it throughout the campaign. So our stories calling out that he had suggested something that just wasn't going to happen had little impact on how he reacted to it. But we did our job in at least informing the people who are reading the newspaper that, no, you cannot reduce those drive times by 10%. So that's a pretty kind of tangible brick and mortar example of how politicians can reach out directly to you and bypass us, and we're going to work hard to make sure that there's some checks and balances there.
But the one thing I'd add is that I also think, just to segue off of that, is that we have to be even better all the time. Because if we make one mistake, even on something what we might consider small, that's just another way. It's a wound. It's an open wound, and we can be attacked there. So we need to be incumbent on ourselves to be the best we can be. To, I think, really try to get a diversity of voices and to understand all parts of the city and the county and perspectives, because there's a lot out there, and I think every part of this county needs to feel like they're heard by us and that we care about their concerns.
Very good.
I suspect I'm one of the people you're talking about. I keep track of the paper. I like Mr. Garcia. He's your only columnist I find who is fair and a brilliant analysis. So I like
Sorry,
him.
Brian.
But the rest bother me. The bias of the news bothers me. I don't care about your editorial page because that's what editorial pages are supposed to do. But since Ms. Stockwell has come there and replaced Ribard. The paper is moved to the left. And it's in the columns. There's only Mr. Lowry, who represents the conservative viewpoint. The letters are 3-1, both for the liberals, and it'd be worse if the Alamo wasn't a dispute and I had them in the neutral category. My question to you, though, that's not a question, that's merely my introduction. How many, yes, it is just an introduction, but I'd like to speak. The question to you is, how many of you are either Republicans or conservative? About 60% of the state of Texas is either and or conservative or Republican. How much of your paper, people at your paper who report, not the pressmen, are actually Republicans and or conservatives?
I am 38 years old. I have voted in every general election since I turned 18, and you will not find any primary voting data on me. I choose not to vote in primaries because you have to pick a primary, Democrat or Republican primary to vote in, and I have not done that specifically because of that question.
Next question.
Thank you. My question's on education. I'd like you to comment on your editorial opinion against charter schools, but also applaud you on your fairly aggressive approach to rooting out corruption and so on in the Southside school districts.
Go ahead.
So none of us are education reporters, and none of us are from the editorial department. So that kind of misses our expertise.
But that is going to be one of the things we will be focusing on this special session. That is not necessarily charter schools, but vouchers and just the education system in general. And Representative Strauss has said it's a priority as well. So I think you'll see a lot of coverage. I think this has been a really fun night. I think it's been great. I would love to see us do one just on education in San Antonio and across the state. I think it's a topic we get asked about a lot. Yeah. All right, well, good. We will do that. We have some very strong education reporters who cover K through 12, plus the Alamo colleges and higher ed, and then statewide education issues and national topics as well. So we are, in fact, working on a couple of big stories right now that take a look at education across the city and readiness and preparedness for colleges. So it's something that you can look for in the next, well, I can't promise a date because I'm not sure when it's going to happen, but sometime this year. But thank you. I mean, it's an important topic to us, so you will see. I'm sorry we can't answer your question exactly tonight, but come to the next one.
Final question. Walk this way. I have to hit the outer rim.
Okay, 3 of you up there know me. My name's Durand Waters. And some of us have gotten along and some of them haven't. But my question really is, well, one, you haven't printed a thing I've sent you since March of 2016. I used to get something every other month, so evidently I'm on a blacklist. So also, then there was a comment about editorials. If you actually read the Sunday paper, there were 3 New York Times editorials in the opinion section. And I'm sick and tired of getting New York Times, Washington Post, and there was something in today's paper from the Associated Press, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but it quoted somebody that was incorrect. And so I've put that in, and so now I'm waiting for the reprint. I point out a lot of those things to you. I never see it in setting straight. That is, if it's even printed within the next week or two. So
if you spot a correction, please do send it to me. I haven't seen anything from you.
Okay,
I will say that our editorial
I usually
board,
send those to Ron Seltzer.
Oh, okay.
Seltzer, because
Right.
he's the public editor.
Correct.
And
Yeah,
that's
Robert
his
Seltzer. That is correct, and he's on the editorial board, or he's part of
Right.
the editorial board group.
Okay.
We in the newsroom, we are separate from the editorial pages,
Right.
so I can't comment on the opinions that we run, or the op-eds, or the letters to the reader, or I'm sorry, reader letters to the editor, because I don't have any say over those.
And you all need, at least the first and the third from the left here, you need to update your pictures.
Okay.
Thank you,
Duly
sir.
noted. All right. Thank you guys so much for being here and for participating in this tonight. We're around if you all want to come and ask us other questions.